And with all of that fun music and all those great authors, today we've got Julie here live with us on Amazon, and we'll be talking about her book. And if you are a fan of history like me, I think you're really going to have fun. And if you're not, you're still going to have fun because the world is a great place and you want to get out and see what's going on. So Scott Smith here live on Amazon with Julie, and thank you for joining us today.
Scott, I'm so happy to be here. And I want to say, I just love your tag there, motivational listener. The world could do with a lot more listening, in my opinion. As a
Thank you
former,
very much. Yes,
as a former diplomat, that's what we're trying to do a lot of times. It's just to listen and then to report back.
yeah,
So
I
I
love it.
try to be a motivational listener, but I'm not sure I always succeed.
Well, yeah, thank you. When people ask me about it, first of all, I have to tell people it is something that my wife came up with. Someone asked her one time, Christine, what do you do? And she said very accurately that, well, I'm a motivational listener. And I told her, I love it. I will always give you credit, which I'm doing now because I'm a good husband, but I'm stealing that. And so motivational listener, I think I grabbed onto that back in 2016. So it's been about 5 years. I put some structure around it. But if someone asks me, what does it mean to be a motivational listener? And I know, as you said, being a former diplomat, uh, the goal is for the person that you're speaking to exit that conversation feeling better about themselves than before they started, which should be a great goal for all of us.
Yes, well, in the case of diplomats, our goal is to extract information, not covertly or not secretly or
Hmm.
anyway. It's a game, and we all know our interlocutors are getting information from us, and we're getting information from them. But the
Yeah.
goal is not to be you talking all the time. The goal is to have a dialogue or a conversation and get information from them.
Right. Yeah. So we are here. We've got your book in the carousel, Savoring the Camino de Santiago. It's a pilgrimage, not the hike. So let's start right there. Um, Tell us about
So,
the book and your journey.
okay, so I first heard about the Camino de Santiago in the early 1970s. I had dropped out of my university and gone to Europe. My first country overseas was Portugal, and
Mhm.
my flatmate loaned me a copy of her book, Iberia by James Michener. And for those who are kind of my age, you might remember that James Michener was an extremely successful and popular writer back
Mm.
in that era, the 60s and 70s.
Mhm.
So his book on Iberia is, frankly, for me until today, still the best book about Spain as far as understanding the Spanish character and what
Interesting. Yeah.
motivates them and their
Mhm.
history and their art and their festivals and everything. Now, the book is dated as far as politics, and actually, Michener spends a lot of time talking about the politics because it was still under the regime of Franco, which is
Mhm.
that whole question has gone away. But the rest of the book is still extremely relevant. Anyway, in Iberia, chapter 13 is about the Camino de Santiago.
Mhm.
And I was raised Catholic, and I thought I knew about all of the famous pilgrimages. My
Yeah.
mother and sister had been to Lourdes in the 50s, and in Portugal, I myself had been to Fatima, but I'd never heard of this pilgrimage. So I found it fascinating, and I said, I want to do that. But I was young and poor and working. So I put it in my to do when I can basket. Well,
Mm.
40 years later, I finally had the time and the resources to make the trip.
Wow.
So I did. And for those who don't know the Camino de Santiago, I'll just give a little bit of history.
Yeah, I would love to hear kind of this. So we start with a frame of reference.
Right. So in the year either 842 or 844, depending on your source, a hermit living in northwestern Spain saw some bright lights in a forest. And he went to explore and he found a tomb, actually three grave sites. One
Mm.
of them was labeled James, and then there were the two other names. And he reported this to his bishop. The bishop came and looked at it, and he said, "Oh my goodness, we found the grave of James the Apostle, St. James the Great." And that decision, or that recognition of finding the grave of St. James, was then ratified by the Pope. And that started, so it was right away in the 800s, a stream of pilgrims going to this location in far northwest Spain, which
Mm-hmm.
is now called Santiago de Compostela. And that whole name has a history too. But it's amazing when you find out that in the 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, as many as 500,000 Europeans would walk to far
Wow.
northwest Spain to visit this shrine and walk back again. Of course, they had to go both ways. So this journey would take a year, 2 years. Many people left and never returned because they would
Wow.
die along the way. And over the centuries, the Catholic Church and other organizations built up a whole series of churches and what they call hospitals and so forth to help and take care of the pilgrims along the route. So the Knights Templar and the Knights of St. James, they were along the route guarding and taking care of pilgrims. Of course, there were brigands and thieves and all kinds of bad things out there. So
Yeah.
the Knights were there to help. And it's just amazing to think of all of these people. In those years, the three big pilgrimages were to Jerusalem, to
Mm-hmm.
Rome, and to Santiago. Santiago means James, so this is St. James's burial place.
Wow.
Now, whether you believe all these stories about whether this is really St. James's burial place or
Mm-hmm.
not, the fact is that people throughout the centuries have believed it. And so
Yeah.
people have been doing the pilgrimage for more than 1,000 years. Now, when I heard about it in the early 1970s, it had almost fallen out of common knowledge and people walking it. But several factors, I would say, in my case, it was James Michener's chapter on it, but more importantly, a Spanish priest named Elias Valina started going all over Spain, painting these yellow arrows on trees and fence posts and rocks and all over. And people started saying, "What are these yellow arrows?" Well, he was a PhD in medieval studies, and he started going to conferences all over Europe and talking about the Camino.
Mm.
So gradually, knowledge about the Camino started reappearing in the general knowledge of the world. And the yellow arrows, which he painted all over Spain, pointed the way to Santiago. That's what those yellow arrows were. And
Okay.
then some other factors came along. Let's, for example, Shirley MacLaine wrote a book about walking the Camino.
Okay.
And and perhaps most relevant for American audience is that Martin Sheen and Emilio Estevez made a movie about it called The Way. And
Mm.
so that kind of really exploded the knowledge about this pilgrimage. So in the year before the pandemic, more than 300,000 people walked the Camino or rode a bicycle or rode a horse. That's the three approved ways of doing a pilgrimage, and got their Compostela, which is a certificate saying they've completed the requirements for a
Mm.
pilgrimage. Now, this is an arbitrary bunch of rules about whether or not you made a pilgrimage, but people
Right.
really prize getting their Compostela, so they
Mm-hmm.
try to meet the requirements. And so imagine from in 1972 or so, when I heard about it, 200 people got a Compostela to now, more than 300,000. And you have
Wow.
to understand that many people don't bother getting a Compostela. They
Mm-hmm.
do the pilgrimage, but don't go for the official certificate. So it's
Right.
an amazing story of just the rebirth of this pilgrimage route. And in my own case, I will tell you that I had visited Spain many times, traveled in Spain,
Mm-hmm.
but mainly from Madrid and south, plus Barcelona. I had never been to northern Spain. And it was a incredible I thought, how could I have this gap in my knowledge?
Yeah.
The cathedrals in Burgos and Leon are magnificent. Oh,
Mm.
just incredible. The art and the history of the whole route is so phenomenal. For example, the best preserved castle of the Knights Templar in
Mm-hmm.
all of Europe is right there along the Camino.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So you just walk
Huh.
the Camino and you come to this castle and it's
Yeah.
still there. So
Wow.
the history of it, the
Mhm.
art, the legends, the stories that surround the Camino.
Yeah,
Many of our most famous or popular saints somehow or other got their sainthood connected with the Camino.
right.
Now, let me just throw in here that I've been talking so far about the French route. In fact, a Camino will start anywhere where you start. That's your starting
Sure.
point. The
Mhm.
only requirement is it has to end in Santiago de Compostela. So that's where you're going to, is the burial place of St. James.
Mm.
So there's a lot of other routes you can take to get there. But the French route, is the most highly traveled and has the most in terms of churches and art and culture.
Mhm. There's something, when you're traveling the paths the people have been taking for 1,000 years, and you think about all of those people, uh, and that you're touching the same stones, the same, buildings, the doorway into that castle from the Knights Templar. I know for some people it maybe is not as moving, but for me, there's something very stirring about that type of experience.
Oh, I absolutely agree. There's this one bridge that dates back to, I think, the 1200s at a town called Puente la Reina. That means the Queen's Bridge. And I promise you, walking across that bridge, I got chills because
Mm,
to think of the millions of pilgrims that
mhm.
have trod these very stones before me is just amazing.
Yeah.
And another part of the Camino, you're actually walking on the Roman road. There's these huge, great big paving stones there,
Mhm.
and you're walking on. This is the path the Romans walked, and here I am.
Yeah.
It's just an amazing. If you like history and
Yeah.
art and architecture and culture,
Right.
it's just amazing.
I think one of the things that, to me, as I've studied history and different components of it, is that, although some of our surroundings, that is, the technology or the tools that we use, have changed, but people have not changed.
Well, I think you're right. And one of the amazing things for me that I discovered, and something we might talk about later, is the kindness of the Spanish people.
Mm,
Imagine that you're a humble Spaniard living somewhere in this northwestern part of Spain, which is not a wealthy part of the country.
mm,
And all of a sudden, these thousands of foreigners come streaming along the roads through your countryside.
right.
How would you react?
Yeah,
I have an idea.
disconcerting.
I
Mhm.
have an idea of how Americans would react, and I don't think we would react as well as the
Oh,
Spanish did.
not as favorably, no, not favorably, probably.
Over and over and over again, Spaniards would offer acts of kindness to me and my son.
Mhm.
I was walking with my son that year.
Yeah.
So it was just I was just flabbergasted with
Mm,
how much they cared about and tried to help all these foreigners coming through their country.
yeah. So, would you think, and this is maybe great conjecture and outside of the book, but, do you think that part of that is, the Moorish influence? Because the Mideast culture, I mean, they've prized this hospitality.
Well, I hadn't thought about that, but you're probably right. I was just very surprised from the time I first went overseas, and my first country to live
Mhm,
overseas was Portugal, at how generous and kind the Portuguese were.
mhm,
Things would happen, like, one day I was on a tram, and I asked the tram driver, "Which stop do I get off at?" And a passenger who didn't know me from anybody
mhm.
got off at that stop and walked me to where I was going. He was,
Oh, that's a great story.
and things like that just happened all the time. So the Spanish and the
Mhm,
Portuguese both, of course, were very invested with the Moorish
mhm,
culture. So that
mhm.
could be a factor.
Yeah, but, the other thing, and Julie, I think this is a great compliment to you, is that we do find what we're looking for. And so if I were to go into any country looking for people who were gonna be rude and dismissive of me, I would very likely find that, as
I think
opposed
that's
to
the
finding people who would get off the train and walk with you. and make sure that you're safely delivered.
I think that's an astute observation, and I have to say, the reason I became a diplomat and loved my career and stayed as in it long past the time I could have retired is I'm fascinated by other cultures, and I'm
Mm,
always looking for what's special or unique about other cultures.
yeah,
And not everybody travels with that mindset. You know,
sure.
not everybody travels because they love travel. They might travel because they have to,
Right.
but it can make a huge difference in whether you have a good time and have fun. And
Sure. And so let's just take a step aside for a moment, and I want to ask some questions about being a diplomat. So, um, how did you get involved? Where were you? And the final question, and this is a leading question on my part, and I'll give you that up front, is what about language? How did you get involved with languages that weren't your first language?
okay, well, I'll tell you, I never thought I was going to be a diplomat. I
Hmm.
thought I was going to be a writer. However, as I mentioned, I dropped out of school and went to Europe, first Portugal, and ended up teaching English, first in Portugal, then Spain, then in England. And from that, I knew that I loved living overseas. I loved international travel. So when I came back to the US to finish my undergraduate degree and then my graduate degree, I wanted to be a writer. I thought I was going to be a
Mm.
writer. But I quickly realized I'm not the kind of person writer that can starve. I, I wanted
Reasonable. Okay.
I wanted to have an income. So
Hmm.
I had some jobs, several jobs here in my where I live now, Houston. But I finally decided, well, if I've got to work, then I want to have a career.
Hmm.
So I started thinking, well, what kind of career can I have that involves travel and hopefully living overseas?
Hmm.
And from that, I ended up taking the Foreign Service exam.
Yeah,
So the process of entering the Foreign Service is extremely competitive
I would
and not
imagine.
and not at all short. So it took me 2 years basically from the time I decided I was going to do this until I made it into the Foreign Service Corps. And that is a fairly short length of time. Some people they'll have to take the test 3 or 4 or 5 times
Mm,
before they
wow.
pass. But I think a large part of my success in being able to go straight through was having lived overseas. So
Hmm.
I had that experience behind me, whereas a lot of applicants didn't.
Sure.
So I got into it because I wanted to live overseas, have a career that involved living overseas
Hmm.
or traveling overseas. Um, I mean, I was not a child. I was already 30 years old when I joined, but I was the second youngest in my class, which means
Mm,
that all of my other colleagues who joined at the same time I did already had a PhD or an MA like I did, or they had another career that they were well along in their career, or they were even one of them, my classmates was in her 50s. So we were all experienced people, not just coming out of
mhm.
an undergraduate degree.
Right.
And then your question about language. You actually do not have to have any language to get accepted into the Foreign Service.
Mhm.
If you have a difficult language, like Arabic or Chinese or Korean, you might get a little leg up in the
Yeah.
application process, but it's not a requirement to enter.
Mhm. Yeah.
So there's
No,
hope
it's
for
it's,
anyone.
uh well, and one of the reasons I ask is that, and so I have studied language, and actually, I was in the Air Force and studied, as you mentioned, a difficult language. I studied Korean at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, and then went over to Korea. But the thing that I found in studying languages, including Spanish and German and so forth, is that you cannot separate culture from language. So that if you really want to learn uh, Portugal or Spanish culture, Portuguese or Spanish, then study the language.
Well, I certainly agree with that. I have worked in countries where I didn't speak the language or didn't speak it well, and
Hmm.
I've worked in countries where I spoke the language really well. And
Yeah,
it makes a big difference, not only in how effective one is,
sure.
but also how much you enjoy the country. I
So we
believe.
have Mike ask a question here, and he said, after your pilgrimage, did you feel a stronger bond with all people in general? So it's a very broad question. I like it.
I would say yes, and we might talk about this a little bit later, but one of my takeaways from the pilgrimage, and I said the kindness of the Spanish, is I came home thinking I should be reaching out more to immigrants to the United States and trying to help
Mm.
them more and have more empathy and
Mhm.
more feeling of we are all one in this world and we all need to help each other.
I
So
love
yes,
that. Yeah, I just love I love that we're all in this together. And just remind everybody, we are here live on Amazon, uh, talking with Julie. Just fascinating conversation. In her book, Savoring the Camino de Santiago, it's the pilgrimage, not the hike. And it's available right here on Amazon. We have it highlighted in the carousel. So go ahead and click on it, take a look. She's got an audio sample so you can hear this. And so for those of you who love audiobooks, it is available right there. And get the sample, but click on it, uh, add it to your cart, give it as a gift. If you have any interest in the culture, history, definitely. If anyone that you know, send it to them and be the hero. Just give this gift to them. So Julie, so the foreign service. So we talked a little bit about the language. So Portuguese and Spanish. Are you how comfortable are you with those languages?
my Spanish is really good.
Hmm.
Portuguese, and actually Santiago de Compostela is in Galicia. And Galicia has its language, its variant, it's Galician, and it's quite close to Portuguese, closer to
Okay.
Portuguese in many ways than Spanish. So
Hmm.
I only lived in Portugal for a year and a half. And actually, one of the things that happened there is when I didn't know a word in Spanish, I learned the word in Portuguese. So when I entered the Foreign Service, one of the things I had to do was to scrub the Portuguese out of my Spanish. So I was speaking really pure Spanish and not
Mm.
Spangport or port
Yeah, right.
something. But I
I
understood
love it.
everybody and they understood me. And unfortunately, although I really had high hopes that I would get to serve in Brazil, for example,
Mhm.
or back in Portugal, I never did. So I never got to to go to a country where Portuguese was the language. Whereas
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time in Latin America, so I used my Spanish
Mhm.
extensively.
Yeah.
Can I just
So
mention one thing? Because you mentioned
please, yeah.
there's an audio thing on your carousel, which I'm happy to hear. One of the things that COVID did for me or brought to me, which I was not expecting, is when I wrote my book, I put it in, I had it as a paperback and I had it as an ebook. But because of the pandemic, when that particularly 2020, that year where it seemed like we were just couldn't leave our houses, I ended up working and getting my book translated or transformed into an audiobook,
Mhm.
and that was a whole new learning experience for me. And
Yeah.
then in the end, I also had got a hardback. So it's in four formats: paperback,
Yeah.
hardback, audio, and ebook. So anyone who, whether you like just listening to something or
Mhm.
reading it on the page or reading it on your Kindle, you can. It's available.
Yeah, we love choice, right? And for some books, it's just nice to have the paper version, whether it's a paperback or hardback. And I was just thinking, um, if someone were to want to take this pilgrimage, they would probably want to take your book with them.
Well, two thoughts come to mind. One is I spent a lot of time and energy putting an index in my book
Mm.
because one of the things that irks me is if you have a travel book and there's no index and you
Mhm.
read it and then you know that there's this passage about, let's say, Burgos, but trying to find that passage in the book if there's no index can be very difficult.
Mhm.
Of course,
Yeah,
if you're using your ebook, you can always search for the word. But if
sure.
you're not, if you're in a actual book, I
Mhm.
think having an index is really important, and many memoir travel books do not have indexes.
Mm.
So that's one thing. And another thing for me was that the experience of writing the book,
Mhm.
I know what my emotion is when I write the book, but
Right.
I'm not sure it always translates to the reader. Whereas when you have a narrator, some of
Sure.
that emotion then goes across the transom and can be received
Mm.
by
Mhm.
the person listening to the audiobook.
Yeah. So how did you go about, the process with the audiobook? What did that entail?
Well, I was inspired by another member of one of my groups. I belong to several writing groups.
Mhm.
And he told about that he was putting his book into an audiobook. And again, this is during pandemic. We're all on Zoom. We're just listening to each other. We're not meeting in
Right.
person. And I thought, huh, that's an interesting idea. I'm going to explore that. So
Mhm.
he, gave me some starting tips. And so you do. I mean, in my case, I went through Audible. Audible helps you by saying, okay, here's a whole bunch of people. You put in a bid. It's a
Mm.
so this is the book,
Right.
my book, this is the topic. Who's interested in narrating this
Mhm.
book? And then you get people come back and say, I'm interested, I'm interested. So then you listen to their voices on a
Yeah.
sample. I tell you, I'm hopeless. I was hopeless in picking the narrator. I knew who I liked. Then I asked two people to listen to the samples.
Mhm.
They came up with a totally different person. So I was kind of stymied there for a while.
Mm.
But then another member of one of my groups is an actor and a professional actor, and so I asked him to listen, and he picked the same person I picked. So then I
Okay.
felt good.
Yeah.
So then once you pick your person, you have to negotiate a contract.
Mhm.
And there's all kinds of different ways you can negotiate. You share rights or royalties, or you just pay the narrator. Or I mean, it's just you work
Mm.
out how you're going to do it, and then
Sure.
it's over to them, and your book is in their hands. And they'll send you after I forget. I don't know. They send you a little sample to listen to, and then you say, "Yeah, go ahead," or "No, this is not working."
Mm.
And
Yeah.
then, just like I said, you just off into whatever, and eventually it comes back to you.
So what about, pronunciation? Because that's what to me, that would be a very important part of this particular book.
That's one thing I did right. When I put out my prospectus on what I wanted, I said that the narrator should speak Spanish or know enough Spanish to be able to pronounce words
Mm.
Spanish
Mhm.
correctly, because my book has quite a lot of Spanish words in it.
Of course, yeah.
And so the people who bid on my book did say, I speak Spanish or I studied Spanish or I'm bilingual or, there was all kinds of responses, but they were people who at least claimed they could speak Spanish.
Mhm.
And my narrator did a very, very good job on that. But even so, there were a few words, uh, like I mentioned one, Elias Valina, who's this very important person. Well, my narrator was saying Elias. And I
Oh,
said,
uh-huh.
no, it's not Elias, it's Elias.
Mhm.
And so those sentences she would have to go back and re-record. But
Right.
she did a really good job on
Mhm.
the Spanish pronunciation of the words.
Well, good. Yeah. Yeah, I would think that, you're just talking too about transferring some of the emotion, because as you go through this type of experience, I can't imagine that you wouldn't be touched, and trying to translate that.
Well, it's funny to me because I don't have the gift of being humorous, but sometimes I can write what I think is a humorous passage. I'm not always sure that people understand that what I've written is supposed to be funny. So my narrator, I think, was very good in
Mm,
making those passages sound funny, which I was happy about.
yeah, that's good. So, so then you get the book out there, and now people have the choice whether they wanna do a digital, hard copy, whether it's uh, the hardback book
Paperback.
or the paperback, and the audio. Is there any indication which people prefer for this particular book?
I don't have a good sense of that because
Yeah.
unfortunately the various organizations that sends
Mm,
you reports like Amazon and Ingram Spark and Audible,
yeah.
they don't really break it down very well.
Okay.
So Ingram Spark, for example, does
Yeah.
they have my hardback and my paperback, and they
Mhm.
don't break it down between those two
Yeah.
and an ebook. Anyway, I don't have a good sense of that. But what
Yeah.
I do know is, and this has been one of my motivating spirits, I guess, is that I have a son who does he's not a reader. I mean, it's sad for me as a writer that my son is not
Right.
a reader, but he's not. But he is a listener. He's a
Mm. Mhm.
motivational listener, and he listens to a lot of podcasts and a
Yeah.
lot of YouTube or watches the YouTube.
Mhm.
So I
Sure.
realized there's a whole universe of people out there who might listen to an audiobook but wouldn't read
Yeah.
the actual book.
Yeah.
So
I can see that. To me, I'm very much in favor of audiobooks, although I personally don't get a lot of audiobooks. I do a lot of podcasts, listen to a lot of podcasts. And um, with books, I'm still kind of traditional on that side. I don't know. I like that part. But I was thinking about my father because he grew up in the 50s and didn't have television until later on, but a lot of radio programs. And the thing that he said he liked about it is that he could, the term we would use today is consume the content while doing something else, right? So he could build model airplanes and listen to these radio programs. And this is what I think gives us the opportunity with audiobooks and with podcasts. This is that you can get information that you wouldn't have otherwise.
right. I have a lot of friends that tell me that they listen to audiobooks while they're driving, for example.
Hmm.
So maybe they only can do 10 or 15 minutes in a car, but that's if they do it day after day after day, then they
Hmm.
get a book as they're driving.
Sure. Yeah, I had a long plane flight. And so that's what prompted me to get my first audiobook was I just you get tired of listening to the same things. And there was a particular book that I really wanted to read, but I just didn't see where I was going to work it in. And I thought, you know what? This is going to be the perfect opportunity as I'm walking through the airport, listening on my little earbuds. And I'm glad I did. It's enjoyable to
It's
have that.
funny you say that because my son, I would start out by saying, in general, I'm a traditionalist. I'm kind of resistant to change.
Hmm.
Not resistant, but resistant. Depends on what it is. But in terms of books, I want a book. I want to hold the book. I want to feel the book. I want to
Sure.
smell it if it's a new book. I want the book. But he got for me one Christmas a Kindle, and he
Hmm.
said, "Mom, get with it." I just said, "Oh boy," I didn't. I said, "Oh, that's a wonderful gift. Thank you very much. I'm so happy." Meanwhile, I'm thinking, "This will never get used."
Uh,
But then it occurred to me, I usually take several books with me on a trip,
mhm.
and instead, I could load several books onto this device and not have the weight of those books in my
Right.
suitcases.
Mhm.
So, in fact, I started using an electronic reader as I traveled, and I've continued to do that. Now, I still carry books because not every book is available in electronic
That's right.
format. But this last trip that I just got back from, actually another trip to Spain, I read probably 10 books on that trip
Mhm.
that were in my electronic format.
Well,
How
I was just visiting. I was down in Nashville for a trip and ran into some folks. And as we were having a conversation, a particular book came in mind, and I knew that I had it on my Kindle Reader, and so I could pull it up. And if it was uh, a physical book on my shelf, that's wonderful. But I wouldn't have been able to share a particular passage with them as I was able to at that moment. So there's good and I get there's good. I'll just say there's good and good.
right. That's exactly what I'm saying is, I have Iberia, this book I talked about,
Hmm.
in hard copy, and I also have it digitally on my iPad.
Yeah.
And if I want to find a particular passage, sometimes it's quicker just to do it on the iPad because you can search for it. But they both have value, and
Mhm.
uh, I realize that, and so I'm so glad. I mean, you don't want to say you're glad about the pandemic, but I'm glad I had the time to
Mm,
explore that
sure.
avenue
Yeah.
and follow up on it.
Yeah, it was a friend of mine was talking about how many times he's purchased the Beatles' White Album because he bought it on LP, and then he got an 8-track, and then he got a cassette, then he got a DVD. Oh, and then he bought another LP.
Yeah, sometimes I get unhappy with that planned obsolescence, I will call it, because it seems like a scheme to make us continue buying our favorite things in a new format. But I have to say, comparing an 8-track to a CD, well,
Mhm.
clearly the CD doesn't jump and skip and break and foul up and all of that. So that
Yeah,
was an
yeah,
improved technology,
yeah.
and you just have to recognize that.
Yeah, and so, with the audiobooks, with the digital books, you're able to have a huge library with you wherever you go if you have your phone or your reader. So, the Kindles and again, here we are, we're talking with Julie. She's, her book, the Savoring the Camino de Santiago. It's the pilgrimage, not the hike. It is available on Kindle, Audible, audiobook, hardcover, paperback. Choose your choice, make your choice, or choose multiples. One of the interesting things about Kindle and audiobook is that in many cases they sync up, and so they'll know where you're at, and so you can go back and forth between them. So let's go back to the book and the journey and some of the highlights as you're going there. And in fact, maybe we can talk a little bit about just the title of the book and how you came about there.
Okay, so the title is a reflection of my philosophy about the Camino. And let me just say, when I published the book, I actually was a little bit afraid because the overwhelming culture, at least here in the United States, is that you must walk. You must walk, and depending on how much of a fundamentalist you are about it,
Hmm.
you must walk every step. And you must walk every step with your backpack on your back.
Mm.
And you must go with very little money because part of the experience is experiencing what it is to be
Hmm.
humble or poor or not much money. So you meet all these people on the Camino and they say, "Huh, you're not a pilgrim, you're a tourist."
Uh-huh.
And I don't agree with that. I
Hmm.
don't agree with that philosophy at all.
Yeah.
So on the other hand, you meet a lot of people along the Camino who brag. They literally brag, "Oh, I did the Camino in 15 days." Well, the only way you can do the Camino in 15 days is if you're running. And if you're running, you're not stopping to visit the churches and the
Hmm.
cathedrals and to experience the food and the wine
Mm.
and the culture. You're just taking a long hike, is what you're doing. And for me, that isn't what a pilgrimage is. So the title, particularly the subtitle, is what I'm saying. It's not the hiking that matters as far as I'm concerned. It's actually
Hmm.
doing a pilgrimage. And
Right.
then for me, the verb savoring is very important because
Mm. Hmm.
you're not supposed to run through this experience. You're supposed to take the time to really
Mm.
experience it. So that's the philosophy behind my book, but it's not the philosophy that motivates most American pilgrims. So I was expecting some pushback on that. As I
Hmm.
said, there's a whole spectrum of fundamentalists who do
Sure.
the Camino.
Yeah.
So that was behind that. And then on top of that, I was a little bit worried because my book is not a pure book. It's not totally a memoir and it's not totally a how to guidebook. My motivation was to try to give people one book which they could read before they did their own Camino and say, yes,
Hmm.
this is something I want to do, or no, this is not at all what interests
Hmm.
me. So it has a lot of how to in it, or should you consider this, or what should you think about? And then my own experience, my own memoir chapters.
Yeah.
And it's all put together. So figuring out how to put that together
Mm.
was something I really worried about. And agonized over.
We do live in I'll say, an interstate mindset in the U.S. And the interstate is about the destination. And back when they decommissioned, they took Route 66 off the U.S. highway system. But that was really about this journey, right? And it's become very romanticized in our mind with these different stops and things along the way. And it wasn't just getting from Chicago to LA, right? As the song says, it was the things along the way. And so really we can take uh, this memoir travel book mindset that you brought and really apply it to our lives. It's not just about the destination.
You've hit one of the mottos of the Camino, people tell you, is that it's the journey, not the
Mm,
destination.
yeah.
And I believe that's true. I do
Hmm.
believe that's true. And of course, the Camino serves as a metaphor for life. And a lot of people use the Camino experience as a way to re-examine their life.
Hmm.
If they're thinking that maybe they want to change, or you know, if they have doubts about the way they're living their life currently, they'll
Hmm.
use that time out because it is a huge time out from your normal life. And if you're walking every day, walking, you have a lot of time for thinking.
Yeah.
And then so people re-examine what's going on in their lives.
Hmm. And so did you walk the whole thing?
Okay, so I said in the beginning, first of all, let me just say I did the French route, so it's 500
Hmm.
miles. And
Oh,
I said
wow.
from the beginning, I wasn't going to walk every step. I never felt compelled to walk every step.
Yeah. Yeah.
To qualify for the Compostela, for the certificate, you have to walk the last 100 kilometers. And I did that.
Okay. Yeah.
But besides those last 100 kilometers, I walked a lot of more miles earlier on the route. As
Hmm.
we were walking, my son and I, he actually developed plantar fasciitis, which is
Oh,
a problem.
wow.
So he
Yeah.
really couldn't walk anymore. So
Hmm.
we started engaging in a complicated dance. Every morning we'd talk about what was going on. So some days he would take the bus and I would walk. Some
Hmm.
days there was no bus, so we would both take a taxi to our next stopping point.
Hmm.
It just depended every day. He really wanted to continue walking and he did his best, but it was really painful for him. And the doctor told him he shouldn't be doing that. So,
Right.
anyway, we had this sometimes I walked, sometimes I didn't walk. And for me, it was still very much a pilgrimage.
Hmm.
Because for me, the important part wasn't the walking. It was the going into Burgos Cathedral or Leon Cathedral, which I had never really wasn't
Hmm.
aware of before this. And these are
Mm.
two magnificent cathedrals. You asked before about highlights. I mean, I write in my book, these were two big highlights for me. I didn't know these cathedrals.
Mhm.
I knew Seville and I knew Toledo and I'd been to them and they're great. I'd been to Chartres in France, which is famous for its stained glass windows. Lyon Cathedral is every bit as magnificent as Chartres Cathedral, but who's heard of
Wow.
Leon Cathedral? And I mean, in terms of the stained glass,
Mhm.
they, depending on who you want to believe, one either Chartres or Leon has the most stained glass per square meter as compared to the stone structure that holds it up.
Mhm.
It's an incredible, and Burgos is incredible for a different reason. If I didn't know about those, and so I learned about them. And so, would I
Mhm.
rather be spending a day slogging along the path or spending a day visiting the cathedral? Well, I know what my answer is,
Sure.
but it's not the same for everyone.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's an important point. Again, as you just said, it's the journey, it's the pilgrimage. It's not the what method you took, but that you chose to take this time. And so this was something that came to your attention back, as you said, in the early 70s, well, about 72. And then when you had the opportunity, you took this, but you also took this trip with your son, which you probably hadn't thought of at the very beginning, of course.
No, actually, he only decided to come along with me at the very, very last month. So I had all my plans to make a solo journey, and I
Mhm.
had to scramble around and change up things and, change single booking to double booking and run off to a local store, and get him outfitted and equipped and hiking, walking sticks and everything he needed, and it was a hurry up rush job to get him ready, because I've
Yeah.
been mentally and thinking and planning
Mhm.
for 40 years.
Right.
And he
Yeah.
just came on board at the last minute. But
Mhm.
I think it was a good experience for both of us. First of
Yeah.
all, we were together for a total, I think, of, well, almost 6 weeks
Mhm.
together every day.
Right.
And he had some issues to think about and work out, and I had issues to think about and work out. So
Yeah.
it was good.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just think um, there's probably a couple of different ways that could have gone, right? That it could have deepened the relationship, or it could have, fractured it.
One of the interesting things, and I wrote about it a little bit in my book, is you get to observe other people. And I saw a lot of couples, not a couple like me and my son, but I mean married couples.
Mhm.
And they inevitably, there was the ones I saw and heard talking and had lunch with and blah blah.
Mhm.
Inevitably, one of them really wanted to do the Camino. And the other one said, "Okay, dear, I will do this experience with you."
Sure.
But one of them was really enthusiastic and one was less enthusiastic.
Mhm.
And I would hear them talk like, "How about if we take a day off and just
Mm.
have a rest day?" And, "Oh, no, no, no. No, no, we're going got our destination, off we're going." And
Mm.
I would just look at these couples and think, you wanna do experiences together because this is an experience. But
Right.
on the other
Yeah.
hand, if you have one happy person and one reluctant person, how well does that work?
Mhm.
So I just hope for all those couples that when they got back home, the reluctant one said, that after all, I really benefited from that experience.
Yeah, a friend of mine, does relationship counseling, and, he'll have events, and he talks about the dragor and the dragee, right?
That's right. That's a good way to describe it.
So, yeah, it's just there's a lot of opportunity for this uh, reflection, and of course, most of the people who get the book probably won't have the opportunity to actually take the pilgrimage. But um, what would you say for someone that just was going to read the book and maybe look at some maps and go through? How do you think? What's the best way for someone to kind of experience this vicariously
Hmm.
through the book?
Well, my book, as I said, is more of a for people thinking about going on the Camino and do you really want to do this? There
Mm,
are a lot of memoirs out there. Many
mhm,
people now have started writing memoirs about the Camino. So I would say get some memoirs and
mm,
reading them.
mhm,
And not to give away my book, but one of the points I make about myself is everyone that I've been reading, all the memoirs,
yeah,
always have some great big discovery
mm,
during their Camino, something that they find out about themselves or that they work
mhm,
out, or there's this ceremony where you carry a rock along with you on the route and you deposit it at this one place called the Cruz de Ferro. And it symbolizes letting go of that burden, whatever it
mm,
is. So
mhm.
my son and I both carried our rocks and we deposited them. But I thought, I must be really shallow person because I'm not having this great feeling of discovery or
Mhm.
rebirth or whatever. It took me about a year after my Camino before I thought, okay, I figured it out. I know what it meant for me.
Yeah,
So it's sometimes you have to think about your experience and
right,
process it
right.
before its meaning becomes clear.
Mhm. Yeah, and maybe that's for it's just the deeper, that deeper experience, because when we have experiences like this, and again, when I'm thinking, when you walk into that cathedral and that this has been on the route, and that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have passed through there, and they're all living, breathing humans with pasts and moments and futures and different experiences, and it's all been in that same area. There's an emotional part that happens, and we don't always have the words. In fact, we almost never have the words to truly
Right.
describe the emotion.
And along the Camino, there's all these, I'll call them mystical places. One is
Mm,
Roncesvalles. If you've ever heard of the Song of Roland and the famous tale of Roland and supposedly in the Song of Roland being murdered by the Saracens, the Moors.
mm.
Well, Roncesvalles is this. I can only call. I mean, it's like Brigadoon. It's like it appears out of the mist, and
Wow.
you walk into it, and there it is, and it's this
Mm,
tiny little hamlet, and it's got this. It has had this huge impact on Western culture as
mhm.
far as Charlemagne and Roland and that whole story. And of course, once you're there, you start hearing all the variations that it really wasn't the Moors that killed Roland; it was the Basques, et cetera, et
Uh,
cetera, et cetera. But anyway, it just seems mystical. And
sure.
then this town way across Spain on the other end, O Cerebro, which is one of the high points of the Camino. Same thing. The houses are like from the ninth century, let's say. They're
Mm,
thatched roof, round, they look like a mushroom sort of. And they're right there and they're still there. And you're going, oh my
mm,
goodness, this is like walking back several centuries,
mhm.
walking into a town that is really from the past.
Yeah.
So they're magical. And you have these all along the way.
This is as we know, there is more to be known than what we know. And so you talk about these places that um, maybe there's something different about it. There's something that we don't understand, and I think for people to have that experience, um, oh, it's got to have some sort of a long term impact on how you view yourself and how you view other people and how you view the world.
Right. So, when as a young woman, I got to go up to West Point, and that's for me because I love history and I love American history and so forth.
Hmm.
But the whole idea of the long gray line of our soldiers stretching back through history it
Mm,
really appeals to me. But the same thing on this pilgrimage, you have this line stretching
hmm.
back over 1,000 years of
Right.
people walking this route and
Hmm.
going to this pilgrimage site.
Hmm.
And it really, it just, at least in me, it evokes all these different emotions.
Yeah.
I'm part of the great river of humanity.
Hmm. And it's funny because we build community around um, common hardship or shared interests, and so even though all those people who started 1,000 years ago, you can't see them, and yet you're still part of that same community, which is a very unique group of people because out of all humanity, only you and those pilgrims have made that journey.
Right, but it's amazing. I won't say shocked, but extremely surprised as I walked my first Camino, how many, for example, Koreans are walking
Mm,
this path. And I'm going, what is this?
mhm,
Why are these? This is a Christian pilgrimage route,
mhm,
not in their part of the world. Why are they here? And
right.
so I'm a curious person. So I started asking them and I found out
Mhm,
the answer. And then it's like, okay, for somehow I got the string now with Korea because I was just in Spain. I went to the Pilgrim Mass in Santiago. They have in the morning. It's at 7:30 in the morning, and the mass was for the Korean martyrs. I didn't know there were any Korean martyrs, Christian martyrs, but I sure found out that there were, in
yeah.
fact, or are, and in the 1900s, like 1920, I think you said, there were
Mhm,
these Christians, Korean Christians, who were martyred. Wow. Well, see, just without knowing it, I'm expanding my knowledge.
mhm,
I don't want to say. I was just insular and not understanding that in fact that this whole pilgrimage has
Mhm.
threads that go not just through the Western world, but even to the Eastern world.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating, and and so you've meet these people, and obviously, I mean, having been a diplomat and choosing to live in other countries and having done that even before, it's not like you were intentionally, holding yourself back.
Right, right. I haven't actually been to Korea. Maybe if I
Mhm,
had, I would have had a better understanding of these
mhm,
connections between Korea and the
sure.
Western world than I do.
Yeah,
But I didn't. I have served in the Far East, but
mhm,
Indonesia and Malaysia. So I didn't make it to
yeah.
Korea.
It was, and I'll just say, having been in Korea, it was, I and thinking about the history, one of the things that if you go to Korea, and I encourage people to do this, and go out into the forest, and what you're gonna see is that all the trees are in a grid. They're lined up because every tree on the peninsula was cut down
Mm,
at one point as a way for the occupying country at the time to, if you will, humiliate the population. And so all of the trees in all the forests, although it looks natural, it's all a replanted forest. And so that starts to tie you into that culture. And so I'm imagining that as you're on the Camino and you're seeing these different things and you're understanding these, you're starting to get that perspective. As you mentioned, you're understanding the culture of the people much more deeply.
yes, that's true. That's true. And you get to talk to a lot of people from a lot of different places. Like
Mhm.
one woman that I talked to was from Romania, and she's actually a radio journalist, and she was doing her podcast along, every night
Oh,
she would do
fascinating.
her
Mhm.
podcast. But what she was trying to do was promote volunteerism
Mhm.
because she says that doesn't exist in Romania
Oh,
because
yeah.
of the communist background.
Mhm.
So she was always talking about all the volunteers along the Camino
Mm.
and there are many hostels and church groups that help pilgrims along the way. So I thought, okay, well, that's great. I mean, I had no idea that a Romanian would be trying to promote
Mhm.
volunteer efforts in her home country.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, they, definitely, suffered greatly under Ceausescu, and that history is reverberating. I did have a chance to go to Romania and, up into the Carpathian Mountains and in a little mountain town, it's a resort town called Brasov, and there were, still bullet holes in the buildings, um, from the violence that went on, and so I can imagine what it meant for her to be able to use something like the Camino to, encourage the people to volunteer and to support and to encourage each other and to maybe fill in some of those bullet holes.
Right. I guess the kind of the thought under the communists was the government provides and does everything.
Mhm.
So as a private citizen, you don't do anything free.
Sure. Yeah.
You rely on your government to provide whatever it is you need. And so
Yeah.
I was very interested in her trying to
Mhm.
promote, not in, she wasn't in Romania, she was in Spain, but she was
Sure.
promoting the
Yeah.
idea of
Yeah,
how
but
you
using
get,
the Camino and translating that for her audience. That's wonderful. As we're winding down, and Julia, I have just had a marvelous time talking with you. I thank you for your being so generous to take this time and to share here on Amazon Live and talk about your book and really again just this whole savoring the Camino de Santiago. It's the pilgrimage, not the hike. Is such a great title, and it really um, just takes a look into who you are. So I thank you for that. I want to ask you as we're winding down, though. Uh, about you traveled with your son, which was kind of a last minute scramble to get him in there. But you've talked about other people that you've met along the way. Are there friendships, relationships that are a part of that are echoing out since your Camino?
Um, my friendships are more with the people here in the United States, the people that
Mm,
mentored me before I went on my
interesting.
Camino, and the people that I'm trying to help along on their Camino by offering advice and suggestions and my book. So
Yeah.
rather than maintaining overseas relations so
Hmm.
much. I'm trying to really work here in the US community. There's
Yeah.
an organization called American Pilgrims on the Camino, and I'm an active member of that. And so, in fact, I hope this Sunday I'm going to go on a short hike here in the Houston area with members of the Gulf Coast chapter of
Hmm.
American Pilgrims on the Camino. But anyway, there you do form friendships, and I know from talking to other people, they keep in
Hmm.
touch with friends that they've made on the Camino sometimes for years and years.
Yeah.
Um, I was really focused on making it through every day. What for me was hard was all the walking,
Mm-hmm.
and I did savor when I could the chance to talk to other people along the way.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. So you have this. So you're a member of this organization, and so as we're winding out, what's a way to maybe connect with you or some of these groups? What do you recommend? Obviously, I want people to click on your book, add it to their carousel, or add it. It's in the carousel. Add it to your cart. Get it delivered in whatever format works for you. Give it as a gift. It's a holiday time. Give somebody the gift of the Camino. But what's a great way to maybe follow up with you or some of the activities that they can do here in the
I
US?
just want to throw in there so people know. I mentioned how scared, literally scared I was that my book was going to have some negative reactions. But
Mm.
in fact, it's almost all been positive, and the book has gotten 4 awards, which for me is a validation that the
Yes.
choices I made
Congratulations.
were pretty good ones. So I
Mm.
just mentioned 4 awards. I have 2 websites. One is my author website, Julie Connor Author. So if you
Mhm.
just type that into Google, it'll come up. And then I have my micropress website, which is bayoucitypress.com. Houston is known as the Bayou City for those who aren't up to date on that, but this town is woven with 7 bayous.
I did learn
Um,
that recently. Yes.
so, and as for the organization, again, it's called American Pilgrims on the Camino. They have a Facebook site. You can join the organization. They're a great group to join if you're interested. They have a quarterly newsletter, which I help on their editorial staff, and they're really a good organization if you're thinking about maybe this is something you'd like to do. So I encourage you to try to join them too.
Oh,
And
that's
Scott,
fabulous.
before I just want to tell you, it's always a delight to talk to someone else who has traveled and has experienced the world and has a broader view than just the US is number one all the time, everywhere. The US is fabulous. It's my country. I love it.
Mhm.
But I do
Mhm.
recognize that there are some things about other countries that I also love.
Yeah,
Um,
I mentioned this, and thank you for that. As I mentioned, when I was in Romania, we were there specifically to work with some orphanages there up in Targovishta, and my intent when I went there was I wanted to learn some of the language, and because it helped me learn the culture, and my attitude was is that there's nothing particularly special about being an American, except that we have been blessed with a lot of resources, which means we have that responsibility. And if we can help other people out, then that is the best use of that resource. So, but thank you.
I agree with you, but I also think we have been blessed by a form of government. And our founding
Mm-hmm.
fathers created a structure for us. And we
Sure.
need to cherish our government. That's
Mm-hmm.
my opinion. I was a government worker for 33 years. So I want people to appreciate that our
Yes.
federal government is pretty special and,
Mm-hmm.
and important to helping our country be a great
Absolutely.
country.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Julie. We're gonna, I'll send you to the green room here in just a moment, but hang on and we'll chat. But thank you for your time today.
Thank you. It's been a joy.
Hey, this is Scott Smith. We've just been having a great time talking with Julie about her book, Savoring the Camino de Santiago. It's a pilgrimage, not the hike. It is available on Kindle, audiobook, hardcover, paperback. It is in the carousel. Click on that and add that to your cart. Make it as a gift. And thank you all for tuning in and for Julie for joining us. And with that, we are going to sign out for today.